Evening. Welcome to Ex Libris. This evening we have as our special guest James Tolan. James has asked if we could discuss HD, the book about HD by Robert Duncan. James is also the author currently of Maths for the Forgotten, Red Walls, and Fresh Fruit and Gravity. He's also the co-editor of the New American Contemporary Literature for a Changing Society. He has a PhD from LSU. I like it when they're like that. And he's currently an associate professor at City University of New York in Brooklyn. James, tell us what brought us to HD.
There's a sort of poetry that I love, and the reason I came to poetry was because it opened up not just activity, it opened up a way of being in the world. And I've been struggling of late being an academic as well as being a poet, because the other academics seem to be going to a direction of professionalization, right? Whether they're either becoming more objective and following the whole Oppen, Eliot, even Williams tradition of looking at the thing as an object or the objective correlative, or they're becoming tremendously subjective, whether that's the Ashbery school of wit and play, or the lyric narrative that's so predominant in creative writing programs. And what I found in Duncan was an alternative, right? A way of combining the objective and the subjective in the way the Basho says. I mean, Basho said the problem with most poetry is it's either objective or subjective. And when I read the Duncan book, I was sort of amazed to see that he took poetry as a way of being in a world that gave him permission to live an intense life, and that the poetry is a vehicle for living that kind of an intense life, and that the imagism that he found in HD was not the perfectionism the Pound brought about, but a sense of the organic movement between the objective and the subjective and the internal and the external. And it felt like an antidote to me to some of those struggles I've had with the contemporary poetry world that I find myself in.
That's interesting. Talk to me, just so that we're real clear, about what you're dealing with in terms of a more intense poetic, or poetry, a more intense poetic life.
I think it depends which way you come from. If I'm addressing so many of my colleagues and the poets that I love and work with now, what I find is that they go to the personal. That one of the nice things about being in New York is seemingly many poets want to come to New York when their new books come out and to do readings, and many of them will visit my students. And I'll prepare my students to ask questions about their poetry. And what tends to happen a lot of times is that poets turn the questions into questions about what their personal interests are. So instead of talking about poetry per se, they'll talk about what their interests are and why those interests have yielded the poetry that they do, which is very pleasant, and students enjoy the conversations. But we don't tend to talk about the poetry very much. We tend to talk about personal history and how personal history lends itself to poetry. On the other hand, I'll have so many people that I deal with in the poetry community who think of poetry as some kind of linguistic play. It has no personal element to it at all. And what I'm after, what I'm looking for, is what Duncan's calling the mythopoetic, right? The sense that whatever personal discoveries or personal experience we want to share in our poetry is larger than the self and larger than simply linguistic play.
Well, I'm assuming our mythopoetic beginning is going to be heat.
Yeah.
Do we want to start there? Yeah, go ahead.
I think I'd like to read 2 paragraphs from the HD book first before we do the heat. Is that okay with everybody?
It's okay with me.
Yeah?
Sure.
Okay. Because one of the things I love about Duncan is the extent that he's willing to share. With my own experience, when poetry came to me it was revelatory. I mean, it literally changed my life. I think Phil Levine was the one who said, "You're right to change the world, and if not, you're wasting your time." This experience seemed to change him. So I just want to read 3 paragraphs from the beginning of the chapter. He says, "Books had opened in childhood imaginations of other lives, dwelling in which the idea of my own life had to be taken on depths and heights, colors and figures, a ground beyond self or personality in the idea of man. There were times when Miss Kehoe would present some poem or story as if it belonged to that earlier, atavistic inner life of the person. All the status of appreciation and knowing about things, of reading skillfully and remembering points that were important for tests and what you read, seemed nothing at all compared with the alliance one's own life might make in lives, revealed in men's work that quickened such a sense of kinship. There was Miss Kehoe's admiration for the sensitivity and the intensity that heat made available. But there was her shyness too, as if what had been disclosed in the poem touched upon a similar disclosure in herself. Miss Kehoe's voice told us that something was at issue. The way the poet H.D. admitted, let in to herself through the poem, and then in a double sense, admitted to the listener or reader, being almost a victim of the thickness of air, the bluntness of fruit. That let life use you like this was not shameful, but heroic. To reveal, even if it be shameful in other eyes, propose the truth of what was felt, to articulate just the emotion that was most vulnerable and in need, took courage. I love this. That's where he starts. You know, he might go on for 600 pages of very dense material, but for me, that's where it started. It started for him with the permission to be courageous enough to have an intense understanding of life and an experience of it, and a validation that that was okay in the midst of what was seemed otherwise a very dull and rationalistic schooling.
Does anybody have any reactions to that? Yes? No?
Well,
let's keep going a little bit, because there will be more things we can pick up on. I mean, this is just interesting for me to learn.
Yeah,
I think I would like to not put people on pressure on this, but I think I'd like to recall in some ways what it was that made each of us turn to poetry, or what lit poetry in us in some ways. And that I'm very fond of Duncan's take on this, that his teacher provided this poem to him in such a way that it wasn't to be studied for a test, but it was something that was available to him to affirm a way of being. Should we look at the poem?
Well, let's see if we go around. Could anyone else supply us with a similar experience? I mean, we have poets. How did you come to poetry? Did you have an experience like this, or you just?
It's so hard to talk about the process, because what I say today will be modified tomorrow, or I'll decide that what I said was inaccurate or not clear or wrong, or, and I don't think there's any one thing for me that opened poetry as something that I wanted to pursue. It's a combination of things, and sometimes one of those things will be predominant and the others take a smaller role in a poem, and they kind of move around. But what I like most about what I seek is to make a discovery of a perception or an insight or something that was new and revelatory to me. And that comes about within the poem as it's being written. And what plays into that is the music of the language, the sound of the feel of the words in the mouth can affect those choices, and sometimes the discovery is overwhelming and sometimes it's small. That's one thing. I also like to honor everything that I observe in detail and to revere it. That's another thing I seek to do in my own work, to celebrate it and praise it. Anyway, those are just two elements, I think, that come into my work when I'm in the process of writing.
I think maybe I've ended up as a more mature writer where Patty Ann is in terms of the excitement of making a discovery and feeling that my poems are taking me a little farther ahead of the me that I live with every day, in terms of vision or wisdom or some kind of largesse that I'm not aware of having. But I do also remember when I first started writing and reading with real passion, that there was something about poems, and they weren't necessarily personal poems. They just were poems that struck me, probably for a combination of many reasons, including the language and the imagery. But I loved the sensation that I was reading words written by someone who was so alive to the moment, that this is their testimony to that aliveness in that moment. And I remembered thinking I wanted to be able to do that with my own life, with my own experience, with my own way of being in the world. And that can lead you to personal poems, but that's really not quite what I'm talking about. It's more an intensity of thought, of imagination, which may or may not involve experience. And I could feel it. And even now, I can't really describe it, but I felt it very early on. And it's like, I want to write poems to prove I was alive, the way this person has proved they were alive. So that's what started me off.
You're here. My experience was very similar to Duncan's. At least I think I'm seeing that he's saying something very similar, and that somebody showed me a poem. We were going over Jabberwocky, and I had already read it as a younger person, but I realized that there was something vast and impossible going on. It wasn't so much talking about a person's life experience, but that there was a way of telling that could include nonsense words, that could include myth and encapsulate it, in a new way. And I became very enchanted. There's really no other word for it. I was enchanted by the idea of poetry, and from that moment on, I wanted to do it. And that seems somewhat like what Duncan is saying to me.
I would, Mike, I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
No, I'm done.
Okay, I would just like to add a slightly different perspective, because I rarely write poetry, but I have read poetry all of my life, and I was actually read to as a child with poetry. My mother would read poetry to me. I mean, she'd read Wordsworth, she'd read Coleridge, she'd read Yeats. And I also fell in love with Jabberwocky as soon as I could read. But I think one of the things that I've always had poetry in my life, and obviously increasingly so in these last 20 years or so. And I think there are two things that really affected me. One was that poetry slowed me down, because I used to read everything and just go through it really fast, but I could never do that with a poem. I would always slow down and think about it and be with it if it was a poem that I was interested in, that engaged me. And I loved that, the fact that I would be so immersed in a poem in a way that no other form of writing did that for me. So I just wanted to add that.
I guess I'll be the last. I came in from the other side. I remember being in the class and the same sort of enterprise where we had been brutally torturing poems. And perennially I came up with the wrong interpretations. And ultimately the teacher gave me a copy of Eliot on, the enemy of the day, of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was really kind of an unfortunate thing to give a 14-year-old boy, but it did change my life. It did, it was a moment where suddenly there was a voice I had never heard anywhere else before. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And it ruined the next slide. And I say this honestly, it ruined like the next 10 years of my life as I was going, reading Eliot and then proceeding into somber forms of depression. But yeah, it wasn't too much different from the Heat experience, which I am suggesting now we are ready for. Do you want to see if I can get it up there? I think if you turn off your camera, it will show up on the screen.
Okay.
It's on the screen.
Yeah, it's on there.
There you are.
No
Okay.
one has to turn off the camera.
Yes.
But leave the camera on?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. Heat. O wind, rend open the heat. Cut apart the heat, rend it to tatters. Fruit cannot drop through this thick air. Fruit cannot fall into heat. It presses up and blunts the points of pears and rounds the grapes. Cut the heat. Plow through it, turning it on either side of your path.
Okay, you can turn your camera back on and then we can look at you. That's nice. Thanks. Thank you for that.
I think the thing that Duncan points out that I find interesting to begin the conversation is that Pound brought this up as his version of the perfect lyric poem. That when Imagism started, it started in Pound's estimation as a way to bring HD to the forefront and what he thought to be these perfectly lean lyric poems of hers. So this is the chief example. And just as a refresher for myself as much as anything else, his tenets for Imagism were the direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation, and as regarding rhythm, to compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not the metronome. So, as with anything else, when you're brought up as an example of something in its perfect state, it's limiting. And I think the thing that Duncan brings up so nicely with his experience of heat was not in the closure of perfection, but how hard it seemed that HD was working in this poem to keep herself open to the experience and not to close it down, to rend herself open, to make the heat open and available to her so that she can continue having this intensity of experience as opposed to capturing it, but to keep herself open to it. And I don't know which perspective on the poem is the better one, but I think in looking at the HD book and Duncan's experience, what he's saying is interesting to me, both as someone who reads poetry and someone who writes it. What is it that we do with poetry when we try to make something perfect out of it? We try to make something that's finished and done, as opposed to try to use the poem as a vehicle or a way to remain open, whether it's through line break or stanza or silence or how we deal with the material.
What does that mean exactly? Keep yourself open.
Well, I think in the context that Duncan talked about in the HD book was this notion that you wanted to hold on to everything. That there was a sense that poetry, like bourgeois life, was an achievement. So you would achieve something, and through achieving it, you would just try to maintain it. And with saying open, what he seems to be talking about is this idea that there's an intensity of experience that you have, and the poetry helps you to continue to be open to that intensity of experience. It's something that allows you to keep on being alive in that way. I think right now, whether it's apt or not. I'm thinking of Stanley Kunit's poem, Touch Me, where he's talking about remaining desirous and being touched by his wife and reminded of who he is, to keep open to the experience of being alive. Does that help?
Well, is there more than one way to do that in poetry?
Well, of course, there'd be numerous ways to do that in poetry. But I think for Duncan, this is the poem that he saw that made that possible to him as a way of considering it. So yeah, for Duncan, I would say that there's many ways to do this, and that what he saw in Heat was one of those ways.
I also think it's not like the poems that came before HD, the norm being something that would run to to similes and metaphors and illusions and morals. This is totally in the moment, and it's not reading into it or telling us how we're supposed to think about it. It's very active and very simple, and I think it stands out as opposed to something like Tennyson or Mallarmé, or it's starting over fresh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think it's also what the invitation of what the poem says. And there's the heat, and there's a sense that the heat is oppressive, and that the wind, which we have to read clearly as inspiration, or the spirit, is entering into the poem to break this heat open, to rend it open, to cut it apart, to take it to tatters, to plow through it, so that there can be some openness that happens and open up this path that the poem closes with.
There are two things that strike me about this, about the Duncan version of HD, which is, of course, different from Miss Doolittle's. One is that it is context by that experience of the teacher giving him permission, of this sort of muse-like person, and that muse person is, no matter where you read the essay, that muse person is always there. And the second one, it is kind of the notion of classical mythology, Western classical mythology, because now certainly mythology has expanded in so many directions that that we have many myths to work with. But at the time it was these were originally published, but not 1912. One of the big issues that they were struggling with was they had found the Sappho parchment, and people were retranslating Sappho and from just bits of it, and struggling with Greek and Sapphic Greek, and what did this word mean and what did it not mean. And I think a lot of that notion, plus having that background of that whole classical vocabulary of mythology, of all these gods that meant all these things and had all these powers that everybody knew. You kind of had this sense that a notion like, oh, wind rend open the heat, was not one that you wouldn't find there. That was a sort of a common, a much more common mythology where people were engaged with various forms of deities that they were bringing. Do you think people still have any of that sense of being engaged with deities, of gods, of sub-gods, of all these other forces?
I don't think people would acknowledge it as such. I mean, particularly in an environment where so many people want to be professors, and that's not something that's valued. But I was interested. My wife gave me a book to read by Robert Colasso called Literature and the Gods. It was, I think, one of the Harvard lectures that he gave a couple of years back. And his argument is that what we mean by literature is the appearance of the gods. That the gods, when they show up in something that we've written, is what defines it as worthy of our attention. Now, he clearly doesn't make it out that he means literal gods in the way that fundamentalists would believe in such things, but the presence of something that has some kind of depth and suggestion beyond the personal. So I think that it is the case that there's a movement in that way. And I think the other person who's probably should be invoked at some point in this conversation is Robert Bly, because what Duncan is talking about with the image is fairly comparable to what Bly talks about with the deep image and the deep image poetry of the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And so much of what Bly did with what he would call the mythopoetic, so that you would see the presence of perhaps not necessarily the Greek gods in that pantheon, but you would see the presence of something that had depth beyond to the personal. You even talk about it in a psychological way as having depth beyond the personal.
I think what you were saying just reminds me of that. It goes back to talking about poems embodying mystery and having a power that's beyond simple narrative language.
Did you hear this?
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Patty, are you okay?
I'm okay. My husband came in the room and I wanted to know if he could hear this. I'm sorry. I didn't know it. I didn't mean to interrupt anybody. Go ahead.
It was just the discussion about the poetry and the gods just made me think of the whole the centrality of mystery in poetry and a power of language that goes beyond the narrative.
How would you describe mystery as beyond the personal?
I guess I would describe it as, so we've been talking about the way that poems can open you to experience in a way that is, for lack of a better word, fresh. And sometimes there is the effect of a surprise in a poem will have the effect of almost the appearance of a god. It's something that opens up in a direction that you don't expect, and in doing so clarifies something, or I guess by contrast, complicates it.
It was interesting. I think it was November before last. Gary Snyder was in New York, which is rare. There's a film he was part of, and it was showing there. And he came to give a talk at Poets House. And at that time, there was a display of Charles Olson. And Snyder, who was very jovial the whole time, was a little miffed that Olson was getting so much attention as opposed to Duncan, which seemed surprising to me to bring that up. But what he invoked that I had forgotten was that Duncan's definition of poetry is that all poems should have some measure of music and some measure of magic. And I think when you talk about mystery and that something happens in the poem that's unexpected, that's fresh, I think it ties into what Duncan is talking about with magic. And I remember after that, I asked another poet not to talk about music, because we tend to like to talk about music because it shows off that we're working hard on our craft and that we can take some responsibility for it. But it's hard to take responsibility or credit for magic. And she, pretty much said that I work very hard at my poetry and so forth. And at the end, she paused for a second. She said, but the poems that come in a flash, it feels like I'm taking them like dictation, sort of like Rilke said he took the sonnets to Orpheus as dictation. Those are usually the best ones. And
Of course, go ahead.
No, that for her, no matter how much work she put into certain poems, she could turn them into good poems, that her best poems seem to be the ones that came as a gift. That the magic...
Not the whole poem, but a moment in the poem.
Well, I didn't ask her further questions, but the ones that seemed to come to her with less effort oftentimes were the ones that bear the greatest response from others.
Well, you know, of course, because you're a teacher, that some of the beginning poets always think that you don't have to work to write a good poem, that it's going to come in that way. And I think in some measure, it's the hard work that makes the magic possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's Arnold Palmer, right? Arnold Palmer goes into the clubhouse, and after hitting a shot from the sand trap into the hole, and the reporter says he got lucky, and he says, well, you know, it's a funny thing, the more I practice, the luckier I get.
Yeah, right, right. And of course, when I was talking about a discovery, I think it's the same as the word magic or mystery. When something happens that you didn't expect, and it's a wonderful lift and joy. Mm-hmm. But that involves, I think, a lot of hard work.
I completely agree with you. I think the other thing that it involves that I appreciate that Duncan is talking about is some sense of community with the poets who have come before us, mm-hmm. whose work speaks to us in our own work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the magic too, right? That, yes, I want to take credit for the hard work I put in to make my poems what they are, but I also know that sometimes it seems like listening. It seems like what I'm doing is listening, and that the more I read, along with the more that I work on my poetry, the more it seems like I'm hearing fresh language. At the same time, I can't take credit as my language. Mm-hmm. Not that I'm plagiarizing or stealing, like Eliot says, the great poets steal, but that somehow the voices of all the poets that I love somehow create some language for me that seems fresh and new, but it's almost like I'm capturing words that are in the air or words that are delivered to me and not words that somehow I've, constructed on the typewriter.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. That's true.
I want to pick up on two words you guys have just used, listening and the notion of hard work. And now I'm talking about process, and I don't want to take us too far from Duncan, but I remember years ago when I was still pretty young, Richard Hugo said to me, I was telling him how long it took me to write poems, and he said, "Oh, don't worry, as you get older, they won't take so long." and he was right. And but what I'm noticing is that I work very hard on some of my poems. And it's that hard work on some poems that makes other poems come out with a certain ease and directness. So the hard work isn't always related to the poem. It's related to what you're doing with your poems. And sometimes the hard work manifests in the ease of other poems you're going to write. And I think this feeds into listening too, because I think as we work and revise, or as we read carefully other people, we're always practicing listening. And that practice of listening, I think, makes us better and better listeners of our own work as we get older. And I guess maybe what I'm experiencing is that because I'm listening better to my own language, I'm able to bring those poems to a certain completion a little faster than I was able to do when I was much younger and I really didn't know what I was doing and I didn't know what I was listening for.
Well, that's a good point.
We also live in a period of very peculiar poetry, where we have probably more professional poets alive now than ever in the history of mankind. And there, by and large, the larger and larger numbers are younger and younger. So that what we look for in a certain sense is these poets, is we look for a talent, not a completion. We look for a person that seems to have that possibility of creating something more than they already have. That there's a kind of role that we're looking for. That they have a genius in the old sense. That they have that sort of engagement. Where does that go? I'm not sure, because we've got so many of them, and every every year each academic class has to find another genius or another number of geniuses. Somebody gets a scholarship and somebody doesn't. But that realm of poetry, I think, is also there now as part of the conversation. That there's just so much poetry. I mean, just so much to read. So many people writing. What it begs the question of is, why do people write poetry? What is the role of a poet? What's a poem supposed to do? If we assume it at its best, what would a poem do? What should a poet expect it to do?
Wake a reader up. Wake yourself up.
From what?
Pardon?
Do you say from what or for what?
I'll take either one. And prepositions have always been problems for me. From what or for what? What?
I hope you meant for, but I think you said from.
Well, either way, I'll take either one. I don't want to hinge on an R, but let's go.
You mean for an action of some sort, or?
What would you? Why would we bother to engage in, what everyone has clearly understood as is a long vocational world of hard work, training, conversations with the dead, all of these endless revisions.
Just think about, how do you feel after a day of working on poems as opposed to how you feel after a day of not working on poems, and then take it from there.
I went to see Peter Brook, the director, talk a few months ago, and I didn't remember the word because I couldn't find a way to ask it. But he said in the Hindu tradition, there's the notion that there's a big wheel that the mass culture is pushing, and there's no way to stop this big wheel of mass culture that's being pushed. But there still needs to be poets and artists and dreamers, perhaps waking dreamers, that are pushing back against that wheel. And there are moments in the culture where the wheel reverses to some extent and change happens. So I would think that one of the things that happens in poetry is that we return to the poetry that we love to remind us that there's ways of being in the world and ways of experiencing language that open us up to those awake sort of moments. And I think the thing that happens, unfortunately, with the professionalization is that when you professionalize, you're not an amateur anymore. And when you're an amateur, you do something out of love. And that's the root of the word amateur. Whereas when you're professional, you're doing something where you're learning a kind of language and expertise that you have to justify your own hobbies and expertise in. And I think one of the beautiful things that Duncan gets to in the HD book is he goes to HD's poem Pygmalion. And she ends that poem by saying, if I can get to it right here, "Now am I the power," this is the sculptor, "that has made this fire as of old I made the gods, start from the rocks. Am I the god, or does this am I the god, or does this fire carve me for its use?" And I think that's the notion I get back to, that what the poetry is for, is the poetry is for, in some ways, no matter how hard we work and no matter how much effort we put into and how wise we may become in this process and how joyous we may feel after a day of working at poetry, there is all this the sense that maybe we feel so good about that because the poetry is making us into something different than what the mass culture would have us be, and into something that we didn't expect for ourselves that still seems wonderful.
Would you think of poetry as a religious kind of experience?
Well, not as an institutionally religious experience, but religion means, the word means linking, right? To link back to something. So I think that what Duncan is talking about that I would agree with is that poetry links us back to those poets, to those voices, to those ways of being in the world that I at least want to participate in. So that when I sit down to write, or when I try to live my life as a poet and not someone who just secrets himself away to write poems, I feel like I'm participating in a community of feeling, is what Duncan calls it, with Basho and Emily Dickinson and Richard Hugo and Lucian Strike and Rilke and so forth. And that seems like a wonderful world to link back to.
You're talking not merely of a poetry which is Vatic, seer-based, finding the God in the experience sort of poetry, but you're also talking about a poetry that takes some commitment by both reader and poet to, in investing and investiture, as opposed to a lot of the poetry that a lot of people think of in today's world is either something that's done for an audience in that particular moment to get approval of the audience, or to be published and to establish one's career. Both of which may have their own validity, but they're not the kind of poetry you're talking about. You're talking about something that there's a quest to it.
Yes, and also that. I think one of the poets that I most enjoy arguing with, not necessarily personally, because I don't know him very well at all, but through his writing, is Tony Hoagland. And Tony Hoagland seems to insist that a poem has to be something that's available to you on first reading, right? That you should be able to read the poem and have the experience of the poem. And there's a lot of things that he says that I agree with and I'm fascinated by, but that's one I very much disagree with, is that I think that what's being suggested is that one should be able to learn through poetry, and that poetry should be able to challenge one, and that one should be able to use it as a vehicle to know what one doesn't know. And not particularly study, not that I need a compendium like I would for reading Hart Crane's Bridge. But say, for instance, Laura Kazishki's last book, Infinitesimals, I love Space and Chains. Then I went to Infinitesimals, and it was completely different, and I was frustrated by the book. And it goes back to the conversation about H.G.'s poem Heat, that what Kazishki seems to be doing in Infinitesimals is comparable to what H.G. is doing in Heat, but you're doing it much more through enjambment and colon and dash to keep the poem moving and open and not stopping the energy, so that she's suggesting images that lead to places that are unexpected. And it required a lot of effort to read that book for me 3 times through before I started understanding what she was doing. But what a wonderful feeling to be able to spend that much time with a poet and their work and to have that experience.
You're mentioning her technique a little bit, dashes and I don't know what were the other words you used, but aren't those comparable to metaphor? And I don't mean the same, but I mean they are a tool of the craft, like a metaphor, like an allusion, like all the terms we know that have been used for decades and centuries by poets.
Aren't those more sonic? Aren't those more sonic and have to do with pacing?
It's a technique, though.
It is. It's another technique, but it doesn't, it's a different one than what images invite our minds to do. Those invite our minds to do something, I guess, more related to music and maybe something a little bit less conscious.
Well, I don't know.
I think 2 things come to mind. I think that poems, through their sonic qualities, invite us into the rhythm. Right, the sonic qualities of a poem provide the rhythm of the poem, and the rhythm of the poem is where the emotion is derived from. Right, I mean, rhythm means the body in movement, and the body in movement is motion, and emotion comes out of that. So I'm fascinated with how that ties into image. So I think what Leslie is saying is obviously very apt, but there's got to be a relationship, I think, between the sonic elements and the imagistic elements, because they both take us down into the body.
Yes.
Well, that's what music is.
That's good, right? That is good. And I think the other thing that, Patty Ann, that you were saying about the dashes and the colons and so forth is technique. I think that's true. And I immediately was reminded that my first teacher was a man named Lucian Strike, who used to translate from the Japanese, and when he did the haiku, he would use a dash to connect the condition of the first line with the lines that followed, and that was called a kirajai. And what that did was suggest that there was a relationship between two things that seemed otherwise juxtaposed. So it was a way that he showed that the haiku was a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side of what you were saying that I think a little differently about is I struggle with the idea of metaphor as technique, because it seems to me that metaphor is a way of seeing the world that we as poets experience, and that my experience of metaphor is that. It isn't so much that I'm applying a metaphor to achieve an end, but that my experience of the world is metaphoric and it comes across in the poems.
Well, I guess I said that because I thought you were a little dismissive of people trying to write in metaphor and using consonants and alliteration and half rhymes and things, and yet there's going to be something like that that makes a piece of writing different than prose. It's going to be something, one of those elements, or it's going to be the dashes and the rhythms that are established, but some part of craft is going to make this a piece of art.
Oh, I have every respect for the craft that we're engaged in. I just think that the craft has to serve something greater than the person.
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah. I agree with that.
I wonder, though, if all poets don't have some aspect of craft that they think about consciously and at the same time apply other aspects of craft less consciously, but still in very organic ways to the material, which other readers might pick out. I know I've had that experience. I mean, I guess I know I'm very aware of what I'm doing with my images, and I'm doing a lot of stuff sonically, but I'm never aware of what I'm doing. But I know when something doesn't sound good. And I've had people tell me that something's happening in my poem sonically that I wasn't thinking about at all. And I don't mean that as about me so much as I think that all poets must have this lexicon of things that are going on in them at several levels of consciousness and several levels of craft knowledge. But I think those of us who write for a long time and read for a long time have internalized so many different levels of craft. We're not always aware of all the ones we're using.
I think that, yes, very true.
Let me drag us back to something again. We've got the poet, we've got the craft. Where is this poem coming from and going to? Who possesses this poem? Where does it go?
Where's the audience?
No, the poem itself. People are working on this poem and revising it, changing it, bringing it to other people to look at, changing dashes, doing enjambment, doing all sorts of things. What's guiding that? How does, is it the poem making, is it the fire making the poem? What's making it? Yeah.
I called that in my prose book, reciprocal creation, that the poem is creating me as I create it, so that I emerge from it as a different person myself. Because I know that's happening, but it's an experience that's hard to verbalize. It's hard to explain it because it's beyond my language to explain that experience.
It transforms you, and that's what you know, right?
Yes, right.
That's all you can know.
I say these things, and it's not exact and it's not right, but I feel like I have created my soul when I write a poem that the experience of it, I am not the same as I was when I began.
I think this is where we talk about the mystery and the magic, right?
Right, yeah.
Right. Because in the language breaks down for us, right? Because in the one way understand completely what you're saying, that in the making of the poem, your soul is made. But at the same token, we want to say, I made my soul through the writing of the poem. And both are true. Right? Somehow there's some responsibility we take for the making of our souls through the writing. And somehow it's something beyond us that's making the poems.
Yeah.
While at the same time, we're working hard at making them. I mean,
That's right.
You know, it's that metaphoric apparent contradiction, which is really just paradox.
Yeah.
The other thing that strikes me about this conversation is I don't think there are many other vocations, with the possible exception of, say, a religious vocation, that would engage at this level of like soul searching, internal struggle, external struggle, conversing with the dead, memorizing things. Do you think this is something that's entirely the realm of poetry, or?
I don't think so, because
I
there's
don't
a whole
either.
notion of the zone that they've talked about in terms of athletes.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that there isn't something in common. I mean, we have so much mastery of language, and this is our lifeblood. But there are people who I think access that transcendent state of going beyond themselves and linking up with something that, if they felt like it, they could call soul. But maybe they do it on a basketball court. Maybe they do it in one fabulous slalom ski run. And it's just, they're linked up with something. They're lined up. And we have language for it. So we get to own it in a way. But I think this is something that people experience in many different ways. And I think it has a lot to do with doing your homework and then getting out of the way. And then having good luck and a moment of everything aligning. And poets get to have that kind of often, relatively speaking.
I would also say that all kinds of people in the sciences, certainly physicists, certainly mathematicians, also in their searches confront the soul, confront the mysteries, confront, what's out there in the universe. Medical researchers when they are looking into the body. So I don't think that this is something that is, solely the provenance of poets and writers by any means.
No, I don't either. I know it isn't. There's a lot of creative energy in science, and it's the same seeking.
Absolutely. And painters. I mean, anybody in the arts, a dancer, a choreographer. I think that there are, we see so many examples of soul-sucking things in our universe or in our culture that are geared towards consumerism and are just nothing but, surface and glitter and shine. But I think that if you have a passion for something, and I think to pursue poetry you have to have a passion, then whatever that passion may be, it will take you to that place of mystery, of magic, of all of the things that we've been talking about.
Well, a professional pianist or a Yo-Yo Ma, there's something that happens to him with that cello that doesn't happen to every person that plays a cello, every cellist or every piano player. And it is not solely technique or getting all the notes right or getting the counting right. Something else enters that performance. And you don't want to say soul, you can say passion, you can say magic, you can say mystery. It's there in all great work, I would say. But you have to work for it too. You have to be and open. You have to be open for it when it comes.
I think we're going to remember Amadeus.
Oh, I was going to say that. Go
Isn't
ahead.
That true, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I was.
There's Paul Salieri, who works harder than anybody.
Yeah.
And he just can't understand why this, mischievous, crude young man, Mozart, gets better music and produces better music than he does. It just seems unfair and almost makes him question his, it does make him question his faith in God. So
He burns
part of it is the hard
crucifix.
work.
No, that doesn't gain it. That's not the whole thing, because he was trying to bargain for it too. You know,
Yeah.
he's trying to bargain with God or his conception of God.
And he wasn't having fun. Mozart was
Yes,
having fun.
exactly. Yeah, too. That's part of it too. It's interesting that Jabberwocky was mentioned twice, and yet you could call that just playing around with words and sounds. And yet it opened something to people at a certain time in their lives. It was the right poem. So you have to, you do have to have fun. Enjoy it.
Would Jabberwocky qualify as one of Duncan's poems? One of those poems that has those qualities that he's looking for?
I think in a very odd way, right? Because it's a poem that suggests far beyond its elocution, right? Because it's largely made up words, but the made up words somehow suggest both a narrative and some sort of depth to them beyond themselves. So it's a very odd example, but yeah, I think it would work that way.
I wanted to say a little something, unless somebody else wants to talk, about a poem being immediately accessible. You were talking about Tony Hoagland, and I've never had a conversation with him, so this has nothing to do with him for me. But you've read 1 million poems that you understood immediately and never went back to again.
Right.
So it's not wrong to have some accessibility, but there has to be a whole lot more there that draws you back. You know, I love many of Wallace Stevens' poems, but I'm sure at this very moment I couldn't tell you what they mean. I don't understand them, but I just love the way they sound, the way things are put together and you see something in a new way, and I love to read them. But I never could say I understood them. So the mystery, it has to have some mystery to draw you back again. What was that line? What was that juxtaposition?
But it doesn't work if you try to be deliberately obscure.
No.
That doesn't do it. There has to be some seduction, some magic to it that compels the reader to keep looking at it and musing over it. And that's really where the joy is.
Exactly. Yeah.
And even if you suggest that you're trying to write about something or get after something, that isn't easy, right? Something that's got a complication to it that you haven't sorted out yet and you might never sort out. And the poets have been trying to sort out for generations. And all we're trying to do is find a way to get closer to the experience of what it means to love and hate somebody both at the same time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Things like that, yes. I used to like to have my poems end with a question, not literally, but in my mind there was still a question.
That's what Robert Hass says, right? That a fine poem ends on the knife's edge between yes and no.
Yeah, that's a good way. Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
Well, speaking of coming to an end between yes and no, we have used up most of our time. James, we've made you talk a lot. Do you have some other final things you want to say to us? Poem you want to read? Anything message to your posterity?
No, I think the last thing was that we started with the idea of staying open to an intensity, and that poetry gives us a way of validating that. I think the other thing that I want to say is that with so many professional poets now, that our emotional lives are not something that is validated in the academy because it's all about the intellect. And when I'm going back to Duncan, I think one of the things that is so important to me is that he values that emotional life. And then going back and even reading some Eliot and some Pound about imagism and about the kind of poetry they were validating, for them, they even brought the emotions into it as something that mattered. And there just seemed to be so little conversation coming out of so many of the writing programs and the professionalization of poets that values that. And it was just, I'm just happy to see that Duncan opens us up after that conversation again.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for introducing me to this book and Duncan and to this discussion.
And to HD also.
Yes, yes, right, yes.
Well, and thank everyone for participating this evening. We hope to see you next month. We'll be doing Frank Stafford. And
oh, good. Who's doing that?
Did you say Frank?
Frank Stafford.
Well, you said
the poet who committed suicide at the age of 20-something. He's wonderful.
No,
you had.
That was Wickerman did that, did he not?
Wait, have I got this wrong?
You had Naomi down as doing William Stafford.
William Stafford is who we're doing. I'm sorry. And Naomi is going to do a different poet on a different time. So we're working on that one. We have a person in mind, but we're going to keep that as if we needed more surprises. But yeah, we'll have that one up. So yeah, that's our next one. I'm also going to recommend that you might want to go to Amazon and get your copy of Mass of the Forgotten by James Tolan, which is a wonderful book. Thank you very much for doing that. And thank everybody and good evening.
Dom, I don't understand. What is the book next time?
It's
William Stafford.
William Stafford.
I thought you said you weren't going. Okay, all right.
It's going to be William Stafford. We're not sure who the person is.
Oh, okay.
Email us. He'll email us. Stand by.
Well, sometimes he doesn't.
He does it last minute.
Yeah, I know. He does it like 2 days before. But
you have William Stafford in your library, I'm sure.
I do. I just don't know.
Getting out of here. I was so close to getting out cleanly. Thanks.
Thank you, Dom, for everything, for setting up and all.
Thanks for coming. We'll hopefully we'll see more people. And if you're at AWP, you can come and visit us. We'll be there. We have a brief presentation.
I won't be there. Sorry.
There's no reason to announce it. Thanks. Okay. Good night.